One online connection. One fateful night. A tragic outcome. This is the story of Kevin Bacon, a story of trust, vulnerability, and the unimaginable horror that followed. The life of Kevin Bacon and the beginning of the tragedy. Kevin Bacon, born and raised in Swartz Creek, Michigan, was a young man full of dreams and aspirations. At 25 years old, Kevin was beginning to carve out a promising career as a hairstylist. He had recently graduated from the University of Michigan, Flint, where he pursued cosmetology, a profession that allowed him to express his creativity. Hairdressing wasn't just a job for Kevin, it was an art form. He loved experimenting with new styles, colors, and techniques, and his clients adored him for his artistic touch. People who knew him described him as fun-loving, empathetic, and always ready with a smile. Despite his outward confidence and his ability to bring joy to others, Kevin, like many people, struggled with the complexities of personal relationships. He was openly gay, which in some places made life more challenging, but he had embraced his identity and found strength in his authentic self. Kevin's family was deeply supportive of him. His parents, Carl and Pamela Bacon, were known to stand by their son, encouraging him in both his career and his personal life. Kevin was very close to his sister, Jennifer, with whom he shared countless memories and a special bond that went beyond siblinghood. Though his professional life was on an upward trajectory, Kevin was searching for love. In a world where finding meaningful connections is often difficult, Kevin turned to Tinder, a popular dating app that promised the possibility of meeting new people and forging relationships. Tinder had become a go-to app for many in the LGBTQ community, offering a platform to meet others in a more open and accepting space. Kevin, like many of his peers, hoped that he might find someone who understood him, someone with whom he could connect. In late December 2019, Kevin matched with Mark Latunski, a man from Shiawassee County, Michigan. Latunski was 50 years old, significantly older than Kevin, but their initial conversations sparked a curiosity in Kevin. Latunski had an air of mystery around him. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and seemingly well-educated. On the surface, he appeared to be a regular man, perhaps eccentric, but not necessarily threatening. However, beneath this facade, there were darker elements to Latunski's life that would soon unravel in the most horrific way. Kevin, like many others in the modern dating world, decided to give Latunski a chance. He agreed to meet him in person. It was Christmas Eve, and Kevin was in a hopeful mood. He told his family that he had a date and that he would be back soon. His parents, trusting their son's judgment, didn't think much of it. But as the hours passed and Kevin failed to return home, worry began to creep in. Kevin's family, particularly his father Carl, began trying to reach him via phone and text messages, but there was no response. At first, they assumed Kevin might have gotten caught up in the excitement of his date and might be running late. After all, it was Christmas Eve, and perhaps he was simply enjoying himself. But when Christmas Day came, and there was still no word from Kevin, panic began to set in. Kevin's family knew something was terribly wrong. Kevin was not the type of person to disappear without telling anyone where he was going. The Bacons contacted local law enforcement, filing a missing persons report. The police, understanding the urgency of the situation, immediately began their investigation. Kevin's car was found in a parking lot in Clayton Township, but there was no sign of Kevin. His phone was turned off, and there were no leads as to his whereabouts. Kevin's disappearance quickly garnered media attention, particularly in Michigan, where the young hairstylist had made many friends and connections. As the investigation deepened, police began to trace Kevin's last known interactions. It was through his phone records and Tinder account that authorities discovered he had been in contact with Mark Latunski. The police turned their attention to Latunski, a name that was already familiar to local law enforcement. Latunski had a history of erratic behavior and had been involved in several previous incidents that indicated he might pose a danger to others. What started as a missing persons case was about to take a shocking and gruesome turn, revealing the horrific reality of what had happened to Kevin Bacon. The discovery of Kevin Bacon's disappearance and Mark Latunski's dark past. Kevin Bacon's disappearance sent shockwaves through his family and community. As Christmas Day passed and Kevin still had not made contact, the weight of the situation began to set in. Kevin's father, Carl Bacon, was a man of few words, but the growing fear for his son overwhelmed him. The moment Kevin's car was found abandoned in Clayton Township, Carl knew deep down that something terrible had happened. He called the police multiple times, hoping for any sign of progress, while his wife, Pamela, desperately held on to the hope that Kevin would come home. Meanwhile, local law enforcement began expanding their search efforts. Kevin's social media and phone records became critical to the investigation. Detectives quickly zeroed in on the fact that Kevin had used Tinder to arrange a meeting the night of his disappearance. Upon reviewing his activity, the name Mark Latunski surfaced. This wasn't just any ordinary person. As investigators dug deeper into Latunski's background, they uncovered disturbing details that painted a grim picture. Mark Latunski was a man who had lived in Shiawassee County for several years, but his presence in the community was far from normal. Latunski, 50 years old, had a checkered past, filled with strange behaviors and a documented history of mental illness. His outward appearance, intelligent, polite, and somewhat reserved, masked a far more sinister reality. Behind the doors of his home, located in the rural, secluded area of Bennington Township, Latunski harbored dangerous impulses that would eventually come to light in the most gruesome way imaginable. Latunski had previously been married and had children, but his family life had been plagued by instability. His former wife, Emily, had filed for divorce years earlier, citing his increasingly erratic behavior and instability as major concerns. Latunski had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had experienced multiple psychotic episodes, which were well documented in his medical history. Despite this, he had managed to live outside the bounds of psychiatric institutions for most of his life, often cycling in and out of treatment. In the years leading up to Kevin Bacon's disappearance, Latunski's actions had become more erratic and disturbing. He had been involved in a series of minor criminal incidents, many of which involved bizarre confrontations with neighbors and strangers. Latunski's mental state was fragile, and it became clear to those around him that he was deteriorating. Yet, despite these red flags, there had been no significant intervention to prevent him from posing a danger to others. The system had failed to address the warning signs, and this oversight would soon have tragic consequences. As the police delved into Latunski's background, they learned of multiple incidents where he had behaved in a way that should have raised alarms. One particular event stood out just months before Kevin Bacon's disappearance. A man had fled from Latunski's home in the middle of the night, half naked, in a state of sheer terror. The man had run to a neighbor's house, begging for help, claiming that Latunski had tried to hold him captive. When the police were called to the scene, Latunski explained the situation away, saying it had been a misunderstanding and the man had willingly participated in a consensual sexual encounter. The case was closed without further investigation, a decision that would come under heavy scrutiny in the aftermath of Kevin Bacon's murder. Despite these warning signs, Latunski continued to live a relatively quiet life in his isolated home. He was known to frequent online dating platforms, particularly those catering to the LGBTQ community, where he could find partners interested in BDSM and other alternative lifestyles. It was through these platforms that Latunski connected with Kevin Bacon. What started as an innocent conversation on Tinder quickly escalated into something far more sinister. As investigators pieced together the timeline of Kevin's disappearance, they realized that Latunski had been the last person to see him alive. Armed with this information, the police moved swiftly to obtain a search warrant for Latunski's property. What they would find behind the walls of his rural home would send shockwaves across the nation. On December 28, 2019, just 3 days after Kevin's family had reported him missing, police arrived at Latunski's residence. The house was located in a secluded, wooded area, far from the nearest neighbors. As officers approached the home, they were struck by the eerie silence that surrounded it. Latunski was inside, seemingly unbothered by the commotion outside. When police knocked on the door, he answered calmly, as though he had been expecting them. Without resistance, Latunski allowed the officers to enter his home. What they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. In the basement of the house, police discovered the dismembered remains of Kevin Bacon. Latunski had not only killed Kevin, but had also mutilated his body in a horrific manner. The details of what had occurred were almost too gruesome to comprehend. According to Latunski's later confession, he had stabbed Kevin in the back and then hung him by his ankles from the ceiling before proceeding to dismember him. Latunski also confessed to consuming parts of Kevin's body, a shocking revelation that would haunt investigators and Kevin's family alike. The crime scene was one of unimaginable horror. The brutality and depravity of Latunski's actions stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Latunski, however, appeared disturbingly calm and detached as he was taken into custody. He showed no signs of remorse for what he had done, instead claiming that his actions were driven by a belief that consuming Kevin's flesh would protect him from harm. This bizarre and delusional rationale was rooted in Latunski's long-standing mental illness, but it did little to alleviate the horror of the crime. As the news of Kevin Bacon's murder spread, the community was left reeling. A young man, full of life and promise, had been brutally murdered by someone he had met on a dating app, a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows of the online world. For Kevin's family, the pain was unbearable. They had lost their beloved son in the most horrific way imaginable, and the sense of loss and devastation would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The legal battle begins: mental illness or cold-blooded murder. With Mark Latunski in custody, the legal proceedings that would follow were set to be both complex and highly controversial. On the surface, this was an open and shut case. Latunski had confessed to the brutal murder of Kevin Bacon, and the evidence was overwhelming. But as investigators and prosecutors dug deeper into Latunski's background, the question of his mental state became a pivotal factor that would shape the course of the legal battle. From the very beginning, Latunski's defense team argued that he was not mentally competent to stand trial. His long history of mental illness, particularly his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, was brought to the forefront of the case. Latunski's defense attorneys pointed to his erratic behavior over the years, his documented psychotic episodes, and his delusional beliefs that had driven him to commit the crime. They claimed that Latunski was not in control of his actions when he murdered Kevin Bacon, and that he genuinely believed he was acting under some kind of supernatural or delusional directive. The prosecution, on the other hand, sought to establish that despite Latunski's mental health issues, he was fully aware of what he was doing when he killed Kevin. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, how Latunski had lured Kevin to his home through Tinder, how he had prepared the gruesome scene in his basement, and how he had gone through with the dismemberment of Kevin's body. To the prosecution, this was not a case of an out-of-control madman, but rather a deliberate act of cold-blooded murder. The discovery of Kevin Bacon's body had been a massive shock, but the legal proceedings that followed would only add to the emotional turmoil faced by his family. Kevin's parents, Carl and Pamela Bacon, attended every court hearing, often wearing shirts with Kevin's name or image on them as a tribute to their son. The legal process was grueling for them, as each detail of Kevin's horrific death was laid out in court. They had to endure hearing how their son had suffered, how he had trusted a man who turned out to be a monster. As the trial began, Mark Latunski's mental health history became a focal point. His schizophrenia diagnosis had been made years earlier, and he had been in and out of treatment for much of his adult life. There had been multiple instances where his mental health had caused issues in his personal life, most notably in his previous marriages. His ex-wife, Emily, had filed for divorce after Latunski's increasingly bizarre behavior became too much for her to handle. She had described moments of fear, where she had felt threatened by his delusions and erratic actions. Latunski's second wife, Jamie, had a similar experience, claiming that Latunski had often slipped into periods of paranoia and irrational thinking, leading her to fear for her own safety. Despite these alarming signs, Latunski had managed to live outside of a psychiatric institution for most of his life. While he had been hospitalized on several occasions for mental health crises, he had never been kept under long-term psychiatric care. His ability to function, albeit erratically, in everyday life had allowed him to evade more intensive interventions. This would become a critical point of contention in the legal battle. The defense argued that had Latunski been properly treated and monitored, the tragedy of Kevin Bacon's murder could have been avoided. Latunski's delusions were a key aspect of the defense's case. During his confession to police, Latunski had explained that he believed he was acting under divine or supernatural guidance when he killed Kevin. He claimed that by consuming parts of Kevin's body, he was protecting himself from evil forces. This bizarre belief was clearly rooted in his schizophrenia, which often manifests in delusions and hallucinations. The defense sought to convince the court that Latunski was not acting with malice, but rather under the influence of his mental illness. However, the prosecution was quick to point out that despite Latunski's mental health struggles, he had displayed a disturbing level of awareness and control during the crime. For instance, Latunski had carefully orchestrated the meeting with Kevin, selecting his home as the location for their encounter. He had then taken steps to ensure that the murder would go undetected for as long as possible, such as turning off Kevin's phone and attempting to clean the crime scene. These actions, the prosecution argued, demonstrated that Latunski was fully aware of the gravity of his actions and was trying to cover his tracks. The trial also highlighted the broader issue of how society and the legal system handle individuals with severe mental health issues. Many argued that Latunski had fallen through the cracks, that his erratic behavior and prior incidents should have been enough to warrant closer monitoring or even institutionalization. Yet, despite the many red flags, Latunski had been allowed to continue living in society without the necessary supervision or treatment. The tragedy of Kevin Bacon's murder brought to light the systemic failures in mental health care, raising questions about how many other potential dangers might be lurking as a result of untreated or poorly managed mental illness. As the legal battle raged on, Kevin Bacon's family struggled to cope with the overwhelming grief. Carl and Pamela Bacon, along with Kevin's sister Jennifer, often spoke publicly about their loss, their voices trembling with emotion. They described Kevin as a young man full of life and promise, someone who had touched the lives of everyone he met. The pain of losing him in such a brutal and senseless way was something they would never fully recover from. But for them, justice was essential. They wanted to see Mark Latunski held accountable for his actions, regardless of his mental health struggles. Kevin had been their pride and joy, and his life had been stolen from him in the most horrific way possible. For the Bacon family, there was no question that Latunski deserved to face the full weight of the law. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable as each side presented its arguments. The defense continued to argue that Latunski's mental illness rendered him incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. They pushed for an insanity plea, hoping that the court would see Latunski as more of a victim of his own mind than a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution, however, maintained that while Latunski's mental health was a factor, it did not absolve him of responsibility. They pressed for a guilty verdict, arguing that the premeditation and brutality of the crime showed that Latunski knew exactly what he was doing. As the trial neared its conclusion, the outcome remained uncertain. The jury would have to decide whether Mark Latunski was a man driven by mental illness beyond his control, or if he was a calculating killer who used his mental health as a shield. For Kevin Bacon's family, no verdict could bring back their beloved son, but they hoped that justice would be served in whatever form it might take. The verdict, aftermath, and the legal repercussions. As the trial of Mark Latunski entered its final phase, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. After weeks of emotional testimonies, chilling evidence, and deep legal debates, the jury was faced with an enormous responsibility. They had to decide whether Latunski was a mentally ill man who acted under the influence of severe delusions, or whether he was a murderer who should be held fully accountable for his actions. For many in the courtroom, the question wasn't just about the fate of one man, but also about the broader issue of how society treats mental illness in the criminal justice system. The prosecution made their final arguments, doubling down on their assertion that Latunski had not only planned the murder of Kevin Bacon, but had also taken steps to cover it up. They pointed out his methodical behavior in luring Kevin to his home, the brutal nature of the crime, and his attempts to hide the body and erase evidence. To the prosecution, these were the actions of a man fully aware of what he was doing, a man who had chosen to take another life in cold blood. While acknowledging Latunski's mental health issues, they argued that these issues did not excuse the premeditation and cruelty involved in the crime. The defense, however, made a compelling case that Mark Latunski was a man whose mind was broken, a victim of his own severe mental illness. They highlighted Latunski's long history of schizophrenia and pointed to the bizarre and delusional beliefs he held about his actions. His lawyers argued that Latunski genuinely believed he was acting under some kind of divine or supernatural influence, and that his behavior was driven by hallucinations and paranoia, not a desire to kill for pleasure or malice. They pressed for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, hoping to secure a life sentence in a psychiatric institution rather than a prison sentence. As the jury deliberated, Kevin Bacon's family waited with heavy hearts. For them, this trial was about more than just a legal battle. It was about closure, about trying to make sense of the incomprehensible loss they had suffered. They had sat through every day of the trial, forced to listen to the grisly details of their son's murder, and now they hoped that justice would be served, no matter what form that justice might take. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the forepersons stood to deliver the verdict. In a case that had gripped the nation and raised deep questions about mental health and criminal responsibility, the jury found Mark Latunski guilty of first-degree murder. The decision was based on the overwhelming evidence that Latunski had planned the murder of Kevin Bacon and had executed it with brutal precision. While the jury acknowledged Latunski's mental health issues, they concluded that he had been aware of his actions and had acted with intent. The verdict was a moment of both relief and sorrow for Kevin's family. While they were grateful that Latunski would be held accountable for his actions, no legal decision could bring back their son or undo the pain they had endured. As Carl and Pamela Bacon left the courtroom, they spoke to the press, expressing their heartbreak over the loss of their son and their hope that Kevin's story would serve as a warning about the dangers of online dating and the need for better mental health care in the United States. For Mark Latunski, the guilty verdict meant that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, likely without the possibility of parole. However, even as he was sentenced to life in prison, the case sparked a national conversation about the intersection of mental health and the legal system. Many mental health advocates pointed to Latunski's case as a tragic example of how untreated mental illness can lead to devastating consequences, not just for the individual but for society as a whole. They argued that had Latunski received the proper treatment and care, the murder of Kevin Bacon could have been avoided. In the wake of the trial, discussions about reforming the mental health system in America gained traction. The case highlighted the need for better access to mental health services, especially for individuals with severe conditions like schizophrenia. Many mental health professionals criticized the current system, which often fails to provide adequate long-term care for those who need it most. They argued that society has a responsibility to ensure that people like Mark Latunski receive the treatment they need before their conditions spiral out of control and result in tragedy. The case also brought attention to the potential dangers of online dating apps like Tinder. While these platforms provide millions of people with opportunities to meet new partners, they also carry risks, especially for vulnerable individuals. In the aftermath of Kevin Bacon's murder, many people in the LGBTQ community expressed concerns about safety when meeting strangers from dating apps. The case served as a grim reminder that while technology has made it easier to connect with others, it also requires users to be vigilant and cautious. For Kevin Bacon's family, the pain of losing their son was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They established a foundation in Kevin's name, dedicated to raising awareness about mental health issues and promoting safe practices for online dating. Through their efforts, they hope to prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak they had endured. Mark Latunski's case continued to serve as a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of untreated mental illness, but also about the dark side of human nature. For many, the story of Kevin Bacon's life and death would forever be linked to the failure of systems meant to protect both individuals and society from harm. Latunski's life sentence brought a sense of justice to some, but for others, it was a stark reminder of how much more needs to be done to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Reflections, lessons, and the impact on society. The story of Kevin Bacon's tragic death did not end with the guilty verdict handed to Mark Latunski. For Kevin's family, friends, and the broader community, the emotional scars left by this horrific crime would linger for years to come. The case had shaken the entire nation, becoming a powerful reminder of the fragility of life, the dangers lurking within modern technology, and the consequences of untreated mental illness. In the aftermath of the trial, Kevin's family sought solace by turning their pain into a force for positive change. Pamela and Carl Bacon, heartbroken by the loss of their son, channeled their grief into advocacy. They started the Kevin Bacon Foundation, dedicated to raising awareness about the intersection of mental illness, safety in online dating, and LGBTQ rights. Their mission was to ensure that what happened to Kevin would not happen to others. Through the foundation, the Bacons began holding workshops in their local community and across Michigan, addressing some of the pressing issues that Kevin's case had brought to light. The first was online dating safety. Platforms like Tinder, while opening doors for connections across the globe, also exposed users to risks. The Bacon family, along with safety experts, developed programs that educated young people on how to protect themselves while using dating apps. These programs included best practices such as meeting in public places for the first time, sharing location details with a trusted friend or family member, and being cautious about revealing too much personal information too soon. The second key area the foundation focused on was mental health awareness. Kevin's death, in part, was a result of a mental health system that had failed to provide proper care for individuals like Mark Latunski, whose severe schizophrenia went largely untreated. The foundation worked with mental health organizations to push for more comprehensive mental health services, especially in rural areas where resources were scarce. They advocated for increased funding for psychiatric care and for legislative changes that would allow for more consistent follow-up and monitoring of individuals with serious mental health conditions. One of the most powerful aspects of the Kevin Bacon Foundation's work was its emphasis on LGBTQ safety and inclusion. Kevin had been an openly gay man in a community where acceptance was not always guaranteed. His death highlighted the vulnerability of LGBTQ individuals, especially when navigating online dating spaces. The foundation partnered with LGBTQ advocacy groups to create support networks for young people in the community, ensuring they had access to resources that could help them navigate both their personal lives and the challenges they might face in a world that isn't always welcoming. Beyond the foundation, Kevin Bacon's death sparked broader societal conversations about the intersection of technology, mental health, and personal safety. Lawmakers in Michigan, responding to the outcry over how Latunski had slipped through the cracks, began discussing reforms in both mental health care and how dating platforms should operate. Some proposed legislation that would require online dating apps to implement more stringent safety measures, such as identity verification and increased reporting mechanisms for suspicious or dangerous behavior. At the same time, mental health advocates pointed to the case as a tragic example of the consequences of neglecting those in desperate need of psychiatric care. Mark Latunski's history of schizophrenia had been well documented, and yet he had not received the sustained care he needed to manage his illness. Many argued that the system's failure to intervene in Latunski's case was a key factor in Kevin Bacon's death, and they pushed for changes that would allow for earlier intervention and more intensive treatment for individuals with severe mental health conditions. In addition to the legislative and advocacy efforts, Kevin Bacon's story left an indelible mark on popular culture. The media coverage of his death and the trial that followed had gripped the nation, not only because of the horrific nature of the crime, but also because of the many layers of complexity involved: mental health, online dating, LGBTQ issues, and the justice system's handling of it all. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and news specials explored the case in detail, bringing attention to the various issues it raised. For some, the story of Kevin Bacon became a tragic symbol of a world struggling to balance the benefits of modern technology with its darker, more dangerous side. Meanwhile, in prison, Mark Latunski faced a lifetime behind bars. Despite his defense's efforts to portray him as a man unable to control his actions, the court had deemed him responsible for Kevin Bacon's murder. However, his mental health remained a topic of discussion. Some argued that Latunski should be placed in a secure psychiatric facility where he could receive the treatment he clearly needed, while others believed that his crime was so heinous that he deserved to spend the rest of his life in a traditional prison setting. Regardless of where he served his sentence, Latunski's name would forever be associated with one of the most disturbing cases in recent history. For the LGBTQ community, the case served as a stark reminder of the dangers that can arise from prejudice, mental health stigma, and the vulnerabilities that come with navigating online dating platforms. Many LGBTQ individuals began rethinking their own safety practices when meeting people through apps like Tinder, and discussions about how to create safer online spaces for marginalized communities became more widespread. As the years passed, the Bacon family continued their work, honoring Kevin's memory by making a difference in the lives of others. His story, though tragic, inspired countless people to become more aware of the issues that had led to his untimely death. Through their advocacy and education efforts, Kevin's legacy lived on, helping to protect others from the dangers that had claimed his life.